It is. And, we see in our life 4 seasons, and we see the summer, fall, spring, summer, fall, winter. And Genesis 8, verse 22 says, seed time and harvest, summer and winter. So it names the
Okay.
four: seed time, harvest, summer, winter. The 4 seasons of our ecosystems can also be patterned in a human life.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of the early years, childhood, being a youth,
Mm-hmm.
as your spring season. You mature into full adulthood at 21, and you're in the summer of life, you're in the prime of life. Then you hit midlife, maybe in your early to mid 40s. And the way that demographers define these sometimes is not just full adulthood at 21 legally, but the youngest president ever elected
Wow.
was 43. So they say middle age starts at 43, and then when you get full Medicare benefits, you're 65, so your winter or senior season begins at 65. I don't personally love that approach because 43 is what I turned a year ago and a half, so that puts me in middle age. So I object to that on a personal level. I take that one personally. All jokes aside, this does make sense.
Mm-hmm.
4 seasons of life, and biblically we talk about generations of people.
Mm-hmm.
We date biblical time by generations. So and so begat so and so when he was such and such years old, and then he died, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about history as a succession of generations is a biblical way of thinking about it. And then when you look at generations as seasonal, it makes it very interesting, because if you have a lifespan that's 4 seasons, 0 to 21, 21 to 43, 43 to 65, 65 till death, then maybe actually generations societally will have trends and tendencies that mirror those 4 seasons of an individual human life. Because what is society? It's just the body of corporately of a group of people who are living these 4 seasons out.
Oh yeah.
This is where Neil Howe comes in with The Fourth Turning. This is his more recent book, The Fourth Turning is Here.
Oh,
They put
yeah.
this out 20, 30 years ago, the fourth turning notion. I wish I would have read this in my history studies, but I only read this later. And I don't endorse everything in this book, of course, but Al Gore found it to be very helpful. This is not some sideshow. This isn't like fringy history here. This is mainstream history. And he explains basically that nations tend to have, and he points them out and shows them ad nauseum, 80 to 105-year cycles, just like those Roman historians, 80 to 110 they looked at.
Yes.
Each segment or season is 20 years and change, and they tend to be like history tends to cycle in spring, summer, fall, and winter types of seasons over that 80 to 105-year period of time. Let's take the winter season just for a second. I can't do the full fourth turning because we want to, wrap up and converse soon. But I really think the winter season is especially applicable for us in our time. When you look at the three biggest crisis events in American history, they happened on a cycle. 1781, the signing of the British surrender to the Americans for independence. Fast forward 80 years from 1781, you get the kickoff of the Civil War, 1861.
Wow.
Fast forward 80 years from that, and you get United States entrance into World War II. And all of these had crisis language. Thomas Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. The very name of his publication was called The American Crisis. That's not an endorsement of Paine. That's just what it was.
Yeah.
Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. In World War II, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. That was actually Great Depression, but a day that will live in infamy. 1941. How about 80 more years after that? COVID mandates. COVID mandates. So 2021.
Yeah.
You also get, during those crisis seasons, very notable presidents, and that's not a comment on Biden or Trump. It's just an interesting thing about the past.
Yes.
What historians rank as the three greatest presidents are presidents during the crisis season of Revolutionary War, Civil War, and World War II. Then I want to zoom out and go further back from the United States to Anglo-American history. American history is really a continuation of the British imperial history, just separated and independent. So we were on their cycles. And their cycles were giant war, giant war, giant war, then the ones we just looked at.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? These are happening on 80 to 105-year cycles.
Wow.
So here, number 7, again, the 7th. I put expect giant war there, not because it's a prophecy in the Bible saying 2025 and following is giant war, but we are in the season
Of it.
of winter, of the crisis. We are in the 4th turning. And that actually began in 2008. We're on the latter half of it right now. Interestingly, what was 2008? Biggest financial crisis in American history since the Great Depression.
Good depression.
Wow.
So right on time, the crisis season hits. There's usually a tremor before the crisis season also in each of the cases. We can break them all down. We don't have time, but there was a 9/11 right before that. And then 2008 and following, then you get the big COVID crisis. And, you know, when I look at expect giant war on the cycles, just as a social science guy, looking at this through social science lenses, you could qualify the bio-warfare of what we just went through as the giant war. So it may not explode into World War III, hot war, United States and China and Russia and whatever. It may, but, you know, war might take different forms.
Correct.
As history evolves and changes and morphs. But I want to ask, for our most important purposes, what is the most likely time window for the fulfillment of Revelation 13? I haven't told you much about the other seasons. The summer season tends to be an awakening season, where there is a philosophical, religious, ideological awakening, like the Protestant Reformation, the Puritan awakening, the Great Awakening in the American colonies, the Second Great Awakening, and the Utopian and Millerite awakenings. The secular histories point this out. They point the Millerite movement as being the awakening on schedule, a summer season. 1900s, the summer season was the 60s and 70s with the age of Aquarius and the New Age and the self-actualization and the Jesus movement of the West Coast. The fall season is an interesting one to study as well. It's not so much philosophical as it is sort of an unraveling of philosophies, more existentialistic, more nihilistic, and more individualistic. And you get nonconformist generations coming out of the fall season. That's the generation that I happen to come from and listen to these rock and roll alternative artists and played in a rock band. So I experienced that one where my parents experienced the boomer generation in the 60s and 70s with that feel. And you can see the generations change. When you talk about Gen X, like what are they like versus boomers? They tend to be a little more obnoxiously individualistic. Maybe I say obnoxiously just to be self-deprecating and not prideful about it. But I actually do like a good dose of individualism that we should be taught. Our children should be taught to be thinkers, not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. But it begs the question, the most likely time window for a Revelation 13 fulfillment is not necessarily going to be in a time when individualism is cherished and celebrated, because the whole world wanders after the beast. You get a mass formation event, and the whole world as a collective group mind is following a deception and following coercion. Individual liberty during a fall season is not coercion. Cultural individualism, political liberty, not as likely. There's not as many giant wars and signs of the times and crisis events in the fall season either. So you get to the very end of it with the tremors that begin transitioning you to the winter or crisis season. When you're in this season, listen to the description of this by the scholars, and you'll go, yeah, that's a likely time window for a Revelation 13 crackdown. You go from individualism to collectivism. You go from the fall season, live and let live, over to conquest, conflict of opposing ideologies. People get very tribal, very group-minded, and very collective. Whether this is the woke ideology or enforcement of mandates and all these things. We've lived this one recently, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
But it's not done yet, because Revelation 13 has some more chapters to come. Or it's one chapter, but it has some more events to come. But in the winter season, it's no longer about personal individual faith. It's no longer about that transcendence and personal awakening of the religious movements. It's about community mobilization to meet the crisis. It's like it's holy war time in the winter season.
The word
Wars, famine. Go ahead.
The word that I'm picking up is common good.
I know, I thought that too. For the greater good, the common good of man.
Yeah, for the common good of man. Anybody who tends not to toe the line they're called heretics, the dissenters. They have to be dealt with.
That
Yeah.
makes so
Yeah.
much sense.
And it's in a context of wars, famines, pestilences. So there's great need and deprivation, and there's going to be a scapegoat, and somebody needs to be demonized for what the problems are that we're all suffering from. And people are anxious and fearful. And when we're fearful, our amygdala circuits are firing in the limbic
Yeah.
system of the brain, and the frontal lobe is shutting down, and the love of most is waxing cold, and
Yeah.
lawlessness begins to abound. So here's how it works: consolidation of political power to meet the crisis. Maximum collective energy. Leaders redirect all institutional efforts to meet a common goal with an intensity that nobody foresaw before the catalyzing event. Then, climax of the winter season. Little concern about harsh government methods to meet the crisis. From personal fury to public fury. Whether the enemies are internal or external, they become categorized, just as you said, demonized, vilified, liberties are restricted, strict censorship. Public action happens in a tsunami-like momentum. This is more like nature's most violent storms than a mere season. That reminds me of Spirit of Prophecy. A storm is coming, relentless in its fury. No, we've seen some of this with 9/11 and the reaction to that, 2008 and the reaction to that, the financial crisis, and of course COVID. But our winter season is not over. And you might be like, well, it only has 5 to 8 more years, 5 to 9 more years left, according to Neil Howe, just expectations of previous cycles and the lengths of generations and how old people were when they were having kids in this generation versus that. He's looking at 2008 to 2030 to 34. I'm not putting far off the close of time. He's a secular historian. That's just when the cycle would turn over again to spring. Sometime 2030 to 2034. So we're in the last few years, which is when this tends to get the most intense. And I don't normally quote Vladimir Lenin in the affirmative, but this is an accurate statement. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen.
Wow.
History speeds up during a crisis season, especially the second half of the crisis season. The quantity, the frequency, the magnitude of history-altering events is going to increase, just like birth pangs. Think of it like a grand finale at the fireworks display. That sort of thing is coming. Or to quote Spirit of Prophecy again, what's going to come will burst upon the world as an overwhelming surprise. It's probably not all foreshadowed by those 1990s Project 2025 guys.
Yes.
I'm not going to go to them for my understanding and preparation. I need to read in the Spirit of Prophecy and last day events, and it says there are going to be things that happen that will be an overwhelming surprise.
Yeah.
So hopefully this hour together is helping us think and be prepared, but nothing gets us prepared like studying in the Word of God for ourselves and discerning these things in the signs of the times for ourselves. So,
Amen.
yeah, could history break away from the cycles? Absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, 2 words: divine sovereignty, right?
Amen.
Do you remember these texts in the Bible? We've just looked at the cycles, but these cycles aren't ironclad. We have a sovereign God. And he says the days could be shortened. And they were, right?
Yes.
The papacy was to reign till 1798, which technically they did, but most of the persecution died out in the couple centuries
Correct.
before 1798, after 1517.
The Lisbon earthquake.
Then also, go ahead.
After the Lisbon earthquake, which brought an end to the persecution that was happening during the time in Portugal, which was the epicenter for many of the persecution that were taking place around the world with the Spanish Inquisition and everything else. Yep. Spot on. And what was the year on that again? 1796.
33?
Yeah, 33.
I lost.
Yeah, it was a couple years
There's an
before.
1833 that I may be confusing that with. But yeah, it was in the decades leading up to 1798. So God he shortened the days. And also this one, he should finish the work and cut it short in righteousness. Making a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. And by the way, we have to participate in that one. That's our job.
That's right.
Right? We are not just observers of the signs of the times. One of the signs of the times is that the gospel will go to the ends of the earth, to every nation, and then the end shall come.
Correct.
The 3 angels' messages are not passive. These are active messages we get to give to the world in Revelation 14 before Jesus comes, and that hastens his coming. That's what the Apostle Peter says, that you look for and hasten the coming of Jesus by holy deeds, he calls it. But basically, that most important holy deed is
The gospel.
sharing the gospel.
Yes, God.
So it can be cut short, but it could also be the opposite, which happened to our pioneers. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. But it may seem to tarry for a time, even though God's purpose is no haste and no delay.